What's going on, guys? Your boy Amazing here, back with another video. And in today's Duet Notice video, guys, me going over the best way to go about building characters and building weapons in Duet Abyss as a general guide here for you guys, in terms of knowing like what stats are going to be good for a certain character and knowing how you want to be, building that certain type of weapon or character. So if you guys do enjoy videos like this, definitely make sure to hit that like button and subscribe as we're on the road to that 5k subscribers on the YouTube channel. I definitely do appreciate the support on the channel, guys. We're closing in on that 5k, so thank you guys so much. Now with that out of the way, man, let's hop in and let's talk how you want to go about building characters first. So let's talk characters. Now, the example that I have right here, guys, is going to be Truffle and Filbert. Now, the first thing that you guys are going to notice on a character's details is you're going to see these stats that are highlighted. So on the right side of my screen here, you can see HP is highlighted, max sanity is highlighted, skill duration, and skill efficiency for a character like Truffle and Filbert. So what does that mean? That means that those are going to be the most important stats that the devs pretty much recommend for this type of character. Now, that's not always going to be the end all be all, guys, and sometimes the stats that they do suggest are not even stats that I would say you want to be speccing into. But if you actually look at this and the general idea of what they're trying to push, that's usually what is good for the character. And for a character like Truffle and Filbert, for the most part, I would actually agree with all the things that they have here. HP is really good because she has a lot of HP scaling. Max sanity is very good because she wants to have a lot of sanity to use her skills. Skill duration, skill efficiency, very highly valued because she is a support, so you want to be able to be spamming the support skills. Now, one thing that they don't really suggest though is something like skill damage. But if you actually go to the character skill here and you look at the actual healing amount, that skill is on skill damage. So there are some builds where you're gonna look at, for like certain characters, you're gonna look at Truffle and Filbert here. Truffle and Filbert says skill damage is not something that they actually recommend. The devs don't really recommend you build for skill damage. But for some builds on a character like Truffle and Filbert, maybe you want a little bit more healing, and so you do spec into more skill damage, right? So these are things that you can definitely do, and you don't always have to follow exactly what the devs recommend in terms of these stats. But for the most part, guys, generally speaking, that is how you're going to go about building a character. So if you look at it here, skill duration, skill efficiency, these are things that Truffle and Filbert's really good in. And you can also double check to see, is that actually the case, right? Skill efficiency, skill damage, these are all the effects for this. Skill range, you don't really need skill range. You can see the endpoint damage radius. No one's really caring about the endpoint damage on Truffle and Filbert's effects. But then you'll see things like damage boost duration, skill duration, right? That's important. The uptime on your buff from, Truffle and Filbert's skill, right? If you look at the ultimate here, you can see sanity cost. That's dependent on your skill efficiency. So the higher the efficiency, the less it's going to cost, so that you're able to be in your ult, and it's just going to cost a lot less, right? So like mostly for support type characters generally, guys, I mean, even if we look at like MC here and stuff, they're going to suggest duration. I guess right here they suggest range, but more so for like a supportive build, you would go efficiency duration for a lot of your supports. So Tibeth, efficiency duration, Daphne, efficiency duration. So you guys can kind of get the idea that a lot of supports are going to be mostly efficiency and duration, and then DPSs are going to be more so skill damage, and then either duration, range, or efficiency depending on the type of character it is, right? Now, as another example here, some characters, guys, have all 4 of their stats as important stats. Now, that's one thing where you definitely have to kind of just read on your own and decipher what's going to be the most important for your character's build. Is it going to be skill damage to be dealing more damage? Is it going to be efficiency so it costs less? Is it going to be, maybe duration, right? Or is it going to maybe be, the range and the radius? These are things that you're going to have to kind of go through the character's kit specifically to really understand. But a general idea is that whatever the devs do recommend for the most part is right. But again, for certain builds, like as I mentioned with Truffle and Filbert, sometimes you do want some skill damage so that you're able to heal a little bit more on the build. So that pretty much covers characters, guys. Again, if you want like actual in-depth explanations on how you go about building each actual character in the game, be sure to check out my build guides. I will be making updated build guides for every single character once I do start getting gold wedges and optimal builds, so tune into the channel for things like that in the future. Yeah, now moving on from that, guys, let's talk melee and ranged weapons. Now, melee and ranged weapons in the game at the moment are really not that crazy in Duet Abyss, so there are going to be some things where it's a little bit harder to, make a fairly good build for a weapon at the moment. But the main thing that I'm going to suggest for you guys right now is if you're trying to build a weapon for DPS, you have to go into the stat that the weapon is more proficient in. So as an example here, let's go to Remnant Reminiscence, right? Let me go to a new Demon Wedge set here so we have nothing on it, and we can actually look at the base stats of the weapon. So you guys can see right here, the weapon skill is attack range. Landing a crit with this weapon has a 33% chance to restore sanity, can trigger once every 0.5 seconds. So the passive right there is only giving attack range to the weapon, and other than that, that it's just an effect that's going to be giving you more sanity when you crit. And so as you guys can tell from the passive right there, it's pretty much saying you want to be running a crit, you know, kind of base weapon, right? If you look at these stats right here, the two main stats that you always want to look at for a ranged and melee weapon is the trigger probability and the crit chance. The crit chance and the trigger probability will determine whether a weapon is going to be viable for a crit build or a trigger probability build. Now, as you guys look at it right here, if you can just look at Reminiscence, you can see the base crit chance is 30, which is really high. Anything that's like 25 to 30 is a very high stat of, like, you know, a certain stat. So whether that's crit chance or trigger probability, that's really good, because remember, the way demon wedges work is they're based on the base value of the demon wedge. So as an example here, if we go to focus right here, 100% crit chance, that's going to double our crit from 30% to 60% because it's 100% of our base. And so for a weapon that has really high base crit, it's going to be way easier to build towards higher crit chance and higher crit damage. You guys get the idea. Now, it also goes the same for a trigger probability weapon. So an example would be, you know, a weapon like the Undying Oneros, right? Let me go to a brand new set here. You can see now, if you actually look at the Undying Oneros, the trigger probability is 30%, but the crit stats are actually like not bad. You know what I mean? Like, they're not bad, but the reason why you would go into a more trigger probability build is if you actually read the weapon skill. When this weapon triggers a bonus effect, which is based on your trigger probability, grants 8.6% max HP for 15 seconds up to 10 stacks. So that's something where you definitely want to be speccing into trigger probability so that you have the most chance of increasing your max HP for a character that will need it. As an example here, Truffle and Filbert will benefit from higher HP, more healing, you know, all of that, right? So this is something where you do want to spec into high trigger probability. And again, as we talked about, if you have a trigger probability, you know, demon wedge here, if we have Trammel, 100% trigger probability, if our base is 30, that's going to go to 60. So you guys can see that it's way easier to get higher stats on a certain stat with, you know, weapons or characters that are spec'd into a certain build. If they start out with really high of a certain stat, whether that's crit chance or trigger probability, that's going to be something where you want to invest in that stat. And so that's generally how you go about building weapons and in you know, melee and ranged weapons. It's going to be based on their trigger probability or crit chance. So let's do another example, guys, for a ranged weapon here. So let's actually go to the Entropic Singularity, one of my favorite weapons in the game. If we go to the base stats of this weapon, you guys can see that the trigger probability is 57.75%. Now, that is actually not the base trigger probability, because if you actually look here, the weapon skill says trigger probability plus 75%. And then it also says right here, each shot with this weapon has a chance based on its weapon trigger probability to fire an extra projectile. So just based on the passive alone and the amount of trigger probability that this weapon has, you're going to be getting extra trigger probability. Now, one thing to take into account is that the weapon skill here, the trigger probability plus 75%, this is not, the way I would explain this is it's not like you're adding that after the fact. This is already added, calculated into the trigger probability now. So 75% of whatever the base was added to make 57.75. Right? It's not that 57.75 is your base, because if I was to do a Trammel mod on this, right, if I put like, if I have a base Trammel, you know, 100% trigger probability, you would think it would go from 57 to 114%, but it's not going to do that because the base is different, so it goes to 90. Right, so I guess right there, I guess the base is 40% trigger probability or something like that. I guess that kind of makes sense, like 40 or like 35%. So yeah, you guys can see right there, that is how that works, right? That's how that's able to work and how you're able to get, you know, higher of that one stat. You definitely want to focus in that one stat, and again, it's dependent on the weapon. Now, for a weapon like, you know, the Arclight, right? You can look at the Arclight here. Landing a critical hit with this weapon randomly grants other allies one of the following effects. So sometimes it's just you read the weapon skill, guys, and you'll just know that's what you spec into, you know, right? Like, but then again, there's going to be some weapons like, you know, the X-Crit Duos, and if you wanted to build this thing for like a certain stat, you'd actually look at it at base, and you'd be like, okay, it has 28% trigger probability versus 20% crit chance, which means that I would definitely want to spec into trigger probability. That's how you go about building weapons and characters in Duet and Abyss, guys. And you always want to look at the trigger probability and crit chance always, as that's something that's going to be the main determining factor of how you're going about building the weapon. So yeah, and then again, you would just spec into that certain build and follow what they're saying. So if you look at my build here for the Entropic, I go with a lot of multi-shot, you know, I go with a lot of trigger probability. As long as I'm able to get that 100% trigger probability, that's going to allow me to guarantee proc bonus effects, and that's going to make this weapon very, very strong. And so yeah, that is the general idea, guys, for how you go about building weapons and characters. Again, follow whatever the devs, you know, kind of suggest for the most part in the actual character section. And then for weapons, guys, it's going to be dependent on what the higher base stat is between trigger probability and critical chance. That's usually how I go about it. You know, maybe there's some weapons again that are going to be like fairly similar in both. If you look at like a weapon like the Exiled Thunderworm here, if we just go to here, let me just remove all my demon wedges here. If we go to this set right here and you actually look at the stats, they're fairly similar, right? But the reason why they're similar though is because of the trigger probability effect here. And if you actually read the effect of the weapon, when an electro character triggers a bonus effect with this weapon, the user gains 45% weapon damage. So even though crit chance is at 25%, which is actually really good, the trigger probability is actually less because remember, we talked about it, 75% is being added onto the base. So it's not actually 26.25%. It's kind of like, it's pretty much multiplicative onto it off the base, the original base, which the original base was probably like 15%, right? You guys get the idea, right? If you see that it's, you know, a higher stat in one, that means you probably want to go into it. If you see the weapon skill and the weapon skill is saying you want a certain thing, then you probably want to spec into that as well. But because this weapon hits so much and you see that the trigger probability is a little bit less than crit, you could actually go with a mixed build. And there are, you know, certain demon wedges in the game. Like if we go to the Rage Trammel, critical damage and trigger probability. So you can see some builds you actually spec in both. And that's going to be dependent on the certain type of weapon it is and what the stacks actually look like on that certain type of weapon. So there you guys go, man. That is going to be the build right there, or just the build guide in general for weapons and characters in Duet Abyss. Again, it's going to be, you know, dependent on how you go about building it and what the actual skills of the weapon are suggesting. And same with characters, whatever the devs usually suggest is right. But again, you have to look into the skills themselves on each character individually to really know. So that's going to be it for the video. I hope you guys did enjoy. And I'm going to see you guys on the next one, man. Peace out. Have a great rest of your day, guys. See you later, man.